Karen packed her bags. She was not happy about it. This trip felt like a chore. She was going to Westminster, a city near Denver, Colorado. Her Aunt Millie lived there. Karen had not seen Aunt Millie in many years. She remembered her aunt as being rather particular. People said Aunt Millie was grumpy. Karen knew she herself could be grumpy too. Perhaps it ran in the family, this tendency towards dissatisfaction. The thought of spending a week with another grumpy person did not fill Karen with joy. It sounded like a recipe for a very long 7 days. The flight to Denver was uneventful, which was something. Karen preferred things to be predictable, even if they were dull. She stared out the window at the clouds. They looked like fluffy white obstacles. She thought about her aunt. Aunt Millie had autism. Karen did not know much about autism. She just knew Millie liked things a certain way. Millie did not like surprises. Karen could understand that. Surprises were often just disappointments in disguise. The plane landed with a gentle bump. Denver. Here she was, ready or not, mostly not. Getting her luggage was a hassle. The carousel moved too slowly. People crowded around. Karen felt a familiar irritation bubble up. Why couldn't people just be more efficient? She sighed, a long, drawn-out sound. Finally, her battered suitcase appeared. She grabbed it and headed for the exit. The air outside was thinner here. Cooler too, even though it was early June. Aunt Millie was supposed to pick her up. Karen scanned the faces in the arrivals area. She hoped this visit wouldn't be too awful. Maybe they could just ignore each other in shared grumpiness. Aunt Millie was easy to spot. She stood a little apart from the crowd. She had the same frown Karen often saw in her own mirror. There was no warm hug, just a nod. "Karen," Aunt Millie said. Her voice was flat. "The car is this way." Karen nodded back. "Aunt Millie." The drive to Westminster was mostly silent. Karen looked out at the unfamiliar landscape. Mountains loomed in the distance. They looked rather imposing, perhaps even a bit judgmental. This was going to be an interesting week, Karen thought, or maybe just a very quiet, grumpy one. Aunt Millie's house was neat, very neat. Everything had its place. Karen was careful not to disturb anything. She put her suitcase down gently in the guest room. The room was sparse but clean. It smelled faintly of old books and something else Karen couldn't quite place, perhaps lavender. Aunt Millie showed her where the bathroom was. She pointed out the towels. "These are your towels," she said. "Do not use the blue ones." Karen nodded. Specific instructions were good. Less chance of making a mistake. Less chance of an unnecessary interaction or a complaint. Their first dinner was a quiet affair. Aunt Millie had prepared a simple meal, chicken and roasted vegetables. It was fine. Neither of them spoke much. Karen ate her food, Aunt Millie ate hers. The silence was not uncomfortable exactly. It was just silent. Karen noticed Aunt Millie lined up her fork and knife perfectly parallel when she wasn't using them. She also cut her food into very precise, even pieces. Karen found herself watching these small rituals. They were predictable. Predictability was something Karen could appreciate, even if it came with a side of quiet disapproval of the world at large. The next day, their grumpiness seemed to run on parallel tracks. Karen woke up annoyed that the sun was too bright through the thin curtains. Aunt Millie was annoyed that the newspaper delivery was 3 minutes late. They didn't argue. They just existed in their separate clouds of mild displeasure. Karen read a book. Aunt Millie worked on a complicated puzzle in the living room. Sometimes, their sighs would unintentionally synchronize. It was almost comical if either of them had been in the mood for comedy, which, of course, they were not. This was serious business, this being grumpy. Aunt Millie had very specific routines. Breakfast at exactly 7:30 a.m. The news on television at 6 p.m., no exceptions. She did not like changes to her schedule. Karen learned this quickly. One afternoon, Karen suggested they go for a walk at a different time than Millie usually went. Aunt Millie just looked at her. "My walk is at 4 p.m., she stated. It was not a suggestion. It was a fact of the universe. Karen shrugged. Fine, 4 p.m. it was. She found she didn't mind the rigidity as much as she thought she would. It was clear, it was understandable. no hidden meanings. One afternoon, Aunt Millie announced they were going out. "We are going to the botanical gardens," she said. Karen was surprised. An outing. This was new. She prepared herself for a potentially awkward experience. The Denver Botanic Gardens were beautiful, though. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors. Karen found herself actually looking at them, not just seeing them. Aunt Millie walked slowly, observing each plant with intense focus. She didn't say much, but she seemed less tense here, surrounded by the ordered chaos of nature. Karen noticed Millie avoided the crowded pathways, preferring the quieter, less traveled sections. They sat on a bench near a lily pond. It was peaceful. A child nearby started to have a loud tantrum. The mother looked flustered. Karen rolled her eyes. Aunt Millie made a small noise, a sort of tisk. Karen looked at her. Aunt Millie was frowning, but there was something else in her expression. "Too much noise," Millie said quietly. "Unpredictable." Karen nodded. "Yes," she agreed, "it's very disruptive." For the first time, their grumpiness wasn't just existing side by side. It was focused on the same thing, a small, shared annoyance. It felt surprisingly connecting. Later that week, Aunt Millie was trying to fix a leaky faucet. She was getting frustrated. The wrench kept slipping. She muttered under her breath. Karen watched for a moment. Then, without really thinking, she said, "Maybe try a cloth around the pipe for a better grip." Aunt Millie stopped. She looked at the wrench, then at Karen. She didn't say thank you, but she did try the cloth. And it worked. The faucet was fixed. Millie put the wrench down. Was all she said. But Karen thought she saw a flicker of something like acknowledgement in her aunt's eyes. These small moments began to add up. There was the time they both criticized a terrible television commercial with the same sarcastic remarks. Or the time they silently agreed that a particular brand of tea was undrinkable. Karen realized her aunt's grumpiness was often a reaction to things being overwhelming or illogical. It wasn't just random crankiness. It was a way of dealing with a world that didn't always make sense to her. A world that was too loud, too bright, too unpredictable for her autistic sensibilities. Karen's own grumpiness often felt like that too, a defense mechanism. As the week drew to a close, Karen felt different. The initial dread was gone. She still thought her aunt was grumpy, and she knew she was still grumpy herself. But it didn't seem like a problem anymore. It was just them. They understood each other's need for quiet. They understood each other's dislike of pointless small talk. Their shared tendency to see the flaws in things was no longer a barrier. It had, strangely, become a bridge. A very particular, slightly cantankerous bridge, but a bridge nonetheless. They had found their own unique language. Karen learned that Aunt Millie's grumpiness was often a shield. It protected her from a world that could be too much, too many sounds, too many people, too many confusing social rules. Her routines were not just habits, they were anchors. They made the world predictable and safe. Karen respected that. She saw that beneath the grumpy exterior, Aunt Millie was just trying to navigate life in a way that worked for her. It wasn't so different from how Karen often felt, though Karen didn't have autism to explain her own particularities. She just had her personality. On the last day, as Karen packed, Aunt Millie stood in the doorway. "You will come back," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Karen looked at her. "Yes," Karen said, "I will." There was no hug, no sentimental farewell, but there was something else. A quiet understanding, a recognition. They had found a common wavelength, tuned to the frequency of mutual accepted grumpiness. It was an unusual bond, perhaps, but it felt real. It felt more honest than many overly cheerful connections Karen had witnessed. Karen left Westminster with a new perspective. Grumpiness didn't always have to be isolating. Sometimes, it could be a shared experience. She understood her aunt a little better, and maybe she understood herself a little better too. The trip hadn't been a chore after all. It had been an education in understanding, in acceptance, and in the surprising ways people can connect, even if they both prefer to frown. The mountains on the way to the airport didn't look so judgmental anymore. They just looked like mountains, solid, unchanging, a bit like her aunt, and perhaps a bit like her.